So we are in the life of Paul. We are on his third missionary journey. He is in Macedonia area writing the letter of 2 Corinthians. The letter of 2 Corinthians is very personal. It's almost like his diary. So right here is where he is. Got to have a map. And he's writing down here to Corinth. So 2 Corinthians. We started with words of encouragement, even though Paul was really in a time of struggle. And this is even for me, one of the struggles about systematically working through the Bible, is that we are now going to focus on 2 Corinthians for 3 months, and 2 Corinthians is all about suffering. Suffering that we are going to endure in our lifetime. But he starts out with words of encouragement. So even though he was in a moment of struggle, he still gave words of encouragement. Then comforting those in need. And he literally says, what struggles you're going through, God's going to use those to comfort other people. And then he says, embracing restoration. There was a person in the church that needed some discipline, but he allowed himself to fall under the authority of the church. And because he did that, the church disciplined him, but Paul says, you went too far. Yes, he fell under the authority of the church, but now you're disciplining him too much. So the whole point of any kind of discipline or falling under the authority of the church is that you're restored. Restoration is that point. Then we had Anna's testimony. I have a testimony. He talked about the fact that people were trying to put him down and say, well, Paul isn't really the man of God that you think he is. And Paul said, hey, I don't need a piece of paper saying who I am. Your life, your changed life is a testimony of who I am as a leadership person leading you to the Lord. So now we're in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and I'm only going to look at a couple of verses today. 2 Corinthians 4, 7 through 9. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. And we're persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. Those are some pretty powerful verses, aren't they? Yes. I'm going to ask you this. Have you ever received a gift in maybe an unexpected package? Maybe something valuable came in a simple box, or even something that was worn out, but you knew there was something very special inside it? At first glance, you think, well, it doesn't look special, but inside was something really precious. And life sometimes works that way, and that's what Paul is saying today. We tend to judge by appearances, by strength, by outward success. Yet God delights in using what seems weak, ordinary, or broken to reveal His glory. And today we're gonna look at that at a very deeper level. Last week I got to talk about Moses. And every chance I get, I'm going to dive into the Old Testament. Well, we're going to do that again today. So in chapter 4, he introduces this jars of clay. And in the ancient world, these were very popular. Jars were common. They were inexpensive. They were easily broken. Yet they were used to carry many times very valuable contents. And Paul uses this metaphor to show that the power of the gospel doesn't come from human strength, but from God. So throughout this chapter, Paul deals with suffering, hardship, pressure, resilience, hope, and eternal perspective. Look at what he's saying. We're hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. We think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was praying. And his sweat actually had blood in it. And that's because when you're so stressed out, you have little blood veins and they burst and they mix with your sweat. But a big thing we missed about the Garden of Gethsemane was We picture, oh, this beautiful garden. It was an oil press. It was a giant press where they put the olives in there and they mashed those olives until they gave every last ounce of oil. And that's very symbolic. It's a whole nother sermon, so we don't have time to do it this morning, but I'd love to sometime. So these jars of clay, that's what God's talking about. And he says, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show this all-surpassing power from God and not from us. So these little jars are carrying this treasure. And that's what he says you are. The world looks at prosperity, and we elevate these people, and we say they should be our leaders. They should be the ones making the decisions. We're seeing how that's working right now, right? So, God's saying, I see a broken vessel, but that is what I've made important. That is what I've put something very special inside. Myself, I've made you a vessel of the Holy Spirit. So then he moves on and he says, we're hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. Just think of that oil press when Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane.
The old sewer lines were clay.
There you go. So, suffering, though, does not define our outcome with God. God sustains his people through every trial. The presence of hardship doesn't mean the absence of God. In fact, it often means that he's right there with you, walking through the middle of it. So Paul says that the life of Jesus is revealed in our bodies through suffering. When we endure, we reflect Christ. So, last week, we talked about Moses, right? In front of the burning bush. And how he came to the burning bush. First of all, it was pretty funny. I said, fire attracts men, so God knew how to attract Moses. And I said, what would attract women? And people were calling me all week when I figured this out. The best one was Rebecca. Chocolate. Water. Yes, because the woman at the well, the water was very... So, and I had several other comical ones, but for man, it was fire. God knew how to get his attention. But an important lesson last week was that God brought Moses and he said, I have this big plan for you. And you could tell Moses is like, I'll go anywhere, God, anywhere you want me to go. And God says, great, I'm sending you back to Egypt. And Moses is like, wait, of all the places you're going to send me, that's the one place I don't want to go. That is where my childhood trauma is. And God says, well, I'm sending you back. Because actually what I've been doing this whole time is preparing you for that. So, who else went through some moments when they was a child? King David. We're going to look at King David's young life. So, he was a shepherd boy in Bethlehem. He was anointed by Samuel. He serves King Saul as a musician, and then he defeats Goliath. But there's some interesting stories that happen up before that actually happens. So first of all, it says he was a shepherd. So here's something interesting. Samuel anoints him, says, you're going to be king. And what does he become? A shepherd. Which, remember, was the lowest of low. They didn't even consider them... They couldn't testify. At least that's what historical data says. When they went out and worked, they went out by themselves. They had simple items. They used a staff. It was a long stick, and it was used to guide the sheep. And it would push predators away. And then it had a little hook on the end of it, and they could hook the sheep's head and pull them in as they were walking. Then we had the rod. And this was a little bit of a club-like device, and when the sheep got so far away, fling that rod and that would kind of give them a whack, and they would know, get back into where you belong. And these were forms of discipline for the sheep. This is all about the 23rd Psalm. We always read that at funerals. It has nothing to do with dying and everything to do with living. He says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The staff helps guide the flock, and the rod brings really those who have gone far out, bring them back. Then he has a thing called the sling. These are the 3 tools that a shepherd always had. This is one of the most important tools. It was made of leather, it had 2 little cords, and it was used to launch stones at high speed, and it was very accurate in trained hands. I had a friend who was really into hunting when we were kids, and he would get in trouble pretty much every day. And he would sit in his bedroom, and he would come home knowing he was going to get in trouble, and he would open the door of the mailbox. And then he would sit in his bedroom and put marbles across his front yard, across the road, into the mailbox on the other side of the road. And that was how he actually got excited when he got in trouble, because he got very good with a sling. And that was in modern times.
That was the first airmail.
There you go. When I was, I told you that I spent time in Arizona, and I showed up I was coming shift, they were coming off, and I showed up and I got out and I'm talking to this guy, and I don't know if you know about sidewinders. Snakes, rattlesnakes, very aggressive. They don't like anyone coming into their territory, and they will go after a pickup truck. They're fearless. So I'm standing there talking to this guy, and there was a third guy, and all of a sudden I see him go like this, and anytime you do that, you just jump, because you know there's something behind me, because everything down there stings or bites. And he took the head right off that sidewinder with that marble. And the thing, he said it was coming back to strike you in the back of the calf. And so I was very, very thankful for his skills. So even out there, and I will tell you the cause of that, because if you draw your weapon and fire it, there's a lot of paperwork. But if you throw a marble in a sling, there's nothing. So this guy got very good at doing the marble in the sling thing. So one of the shepherd's most important tools, and he would even use it sometime when a sheep got really far. He was delicate enough to throw that without hurting the sheep. But he could also take out very aggressive animals, dangerous animals that came to hunt. And predators were very popular. Where David was a shepherd, there was lions, bears, wolves, and leopards. And these animals attacked the sheep, especially at night. Amos 3:12, as a shepherd rescues from the mouth of the lion 2 legs or a piece of an ear. So in other words, these attacks were very, very dangerous, and most often they didn't recover much of the sheep. It really shows the violence of what went on where David was a shepherd. And shepherds fought alone. Unlike soldiers, they were alone out in the wilderness. And David, he was just a little shepherd boy by himself out in the wilderness. He was the youngest son of Jesse, and he spent his youth tending sheep. 1 Samuel kind of tells the beginning of his story. There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. So this king that God said he's going to be king over all the people, prophesied, he's out tending sheep. But sometimes God uses humble ways to get our attention. He has a way of humbling us. And then he said, while protecting the sheep, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear, I went after him and struck him. So this now goes to 1 Samuel 17. And this is when he goes to King Saul, and he's arguing why he should be able to fight Goliath. And he says, when I was a kid, I took on a lion and a bear. I took on a lion and a bear. So, that's pretty important, and I was really thinking about that all this week. 1 Samuel 16:7, it says, "The Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." And I feel like I say that so much lately, especially in talking with people and working through some of their struggles, is that God wants to get in here. He's done with the outward appearance. He wants authority over your mind, over your thought patterns, over where your daily thinking of how you're getting through that day. And so this is one of the things he saw with David. God said, I know his heart. He may be a small boy, but I see something there. However, he's still just a shepherd at this point. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Now you would think, okay, from that day forward, now it's time for him to be the king, right? So he's a shepherd before he's anointed as king. He's brought in, anointed as king, the Holy Spirit falls on him, and you would then say, all right, he's ready to go, right? Guess what he does? He goes back out and becomes a shepherd again. So, even after being anointed, David returns. And he keeps saying, when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered it out of its mouth. And if it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. Interesting. So, if you go over to Israel now, you're not really going to find lions. They've hunted them out of existence. However, in David's time, that was an Asiatic lion. They still have a few in zoos in Jerusalem if you go there. But in David's time, these things roamed all over. So this was the lion that David took on. When David said he fought a lion, this is the one. The lions, they were all through the Middle East, including the land of Israel. Today, you can still find them in the wild, but only in India. But in biblical times, they were all over. Lions were all well known in ancient Israel. The Bible mentions lions many times, and they were a real danger to livestock. Lions lived in areas that provided cover and so that they could hide and sneak up on their prey, like forested hills, rocky wilderness, river valleys, thick brush, right where the shepherds would take their sheep. So, in Jeremiah, he actually describes a little bit of their habitat. And he says, like a lion coming up from the thickets in the Jordan. So this indicates that the lions hid in dense vegetation and then they ambushed. I don't know about you guys, but think about, so I grew up on a farm, and the stuff that I did, I would never let my kids do. Doesn't that always seem like that's, we had a 3-story barn. I mean 3 stories. And we were working on the middle of the roof. So the sides of the roof were shingled in there, but the peak was just the studs. The lumber was off, the shingles were off, and you could look down through the barn. And my uncle went down the one ladder, came back up the other side, went to do something, and he said, I left a bucket of nails on the other side. He walked over to me, picked me up, and said, hold on, and swung me back and forth, and then let me go and threw me over the middle of the peak. I landed on the other side, slid down the roof, got my... And I think, kind of back then it was like, we lose one, we'll have another one. It's a farm. Or the favorite was when we had to get the male calves in the spring. We raised beef cattle. So we didn't have nice cows that walked into a stall and you milked them. We had the cows with the big horns, and you didn't dare, or the bulls, whatever you want to, you didn't dare go in that field because the bull would attack you. But in the spring, we had to get the calves, right? So my grandfather would put me in the bucket of the tractor, drive it out there, and say, I'm going to lower the bucket down. You need to grab that calf before the mother kills you. Get it in the bucket, and I'll raise the bucket back up, so then you'll be safe. And I just think about that today. An old Farmall M. Remember the Farmall M's with the narrow front tires on the front? 8 years old, I rolled one over on the side of a hill. I was haying, pulling the wagon, and I got on a hill, and I'm 8 years old. I don't know that the tractor's going to... Yeah, so we think about some of the stuff even we did as children. And we think that, a little bit of trauma there. Like there's some, looking back, that's a rough childhood. And some people can tell stories that those are mild in comparison. And we think about David taking on, as a small child, this lion. And we can almost think that maybe David could have said, I think about the teeth, I think about the claws, I have nightmares. There's things that it was horrible. I have to take medication, and I have to, there's some bad stuff that came about from this happening. And then, as a shepherd rescues from the mouth of the lion 2 legs or a piece of an ear, again, they were very brutal attacks. And then he says, when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered it out of its mouth. And if it rose against me, I caught it by its beard and strike it. So, in biblical days, the beard was the mane of the lion. So this tells me that this image is the lion attacks, takes the lamb, David chases the lion, he strikes it to rescue the sheep, probably initially with a sling, although the Bible doesn't say that because he's just talking, he's trying to convince Saul, let me go take on Goliath, because I've taken on a lion and a bear. He strikes it to rescue the sheep, and then as he goes to rescue the sheep, the lion turns on him. If you can grab the mane of a lion, I'm just going to say you're too close. Right? Yeah, I think that's a pretty simple observation to make. So the lion turns back on him, he grabs it in the jaw area, and he fights it. And why is this detail so intense? Because it means that this animal was in arm's reach for young King David. It shows the lion turned to attack him. It says, literally, if it rose against me. It means the lion turned and literally came after David. And he didn't just scare it away. He stood his ground and he fought. And it shows determination to save his sheep. So God said, you're going to be king, but I have some training for you. And it's not going to come from where you think it's going to come from. I have some very intense training. So, now David says he pulled a lamb from the lion's mouth first. He was determined to save the sheep. To be a king, that's what God saw the heart. He says, that's the king that I want. Somebody that is going to go after every single sheep in the fold. And this shows the mindset of a true shepherd. So then, what else does he say? You think, okay, that's pretty traumatic as a child. Yep. But then he says, I also fought a bear. So he told Saul, again, he's arguing, he says, I killed a bear, which is the Syrian brown bear. And that is a kind of a subspecies of what we know as the brown bear, and that also once lived in the Middle East and Israel. So these little kids would take these flocks of sheep up through the mountains, and there's the lions and the bear attacking them. And if you ever want to know the 23rd Psalm, when it says, I've prepared a table in the presence of mine enemies, it means that some of the shepherds would go ahead to the top of the mountain, which was called the tableland, and they would hunt the lion and the bear and clear the area so when the sheep got to the top of the mountain, they could kick their feet up and just bask in the sun. We call that, as a Christian, mountaintop experience. Those moments when there's no enemy that can get to you. You just know I'm in a final place. I've made it through this trial. I've made it to the mountaintop. But that's what it means when it says, I've prepared a table in the presence of mine enemies. So, yeah, these were pretty good-sized bear. I'm not sure anybody here would send their children out. They were in Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Mesopotamia. They lived in the mountains, forests, rocky hills, wilderness areas. They weighed about 550 pounds. They were 7 feet tall. And they had long claws for tearing. A bear attack would have been actually far more dangerous than a lion attack because a bear relies heavily just on raw strength. A lion will sneak up, ambush, and try to run. A bear is like, I'm just taking... My brother said he went camping in Allegheny State Park in New York, which is infested with bear now. They're just everywhere. So he says, we're sitting at the campfire, and the bear runs right through the middle of the campfire and grabs his cooler and just takes off with the cooler, like under its arm, running. So my brother says, I jump up and chase it. Without really thinking. He says, that was my first, And he says, we get to the woods and we start winding down a trail in the woods and the bear's running and then it just stops and turns around and looks at my brother like, hey, we're in my territory now. Do you want to continue this? And my brother said, I just stopped and realized, what am I doing? He goes, go ahead and enjoy. And he says, the bear just sat down looking at him like, I'm gonna, flipped the lid open and just started eating. And he says, I went back 2 hours later and the cooler was there, emptied out, and the bear was gone. So he's like, but for a split second, I'm chasing this thing, and then it's to this day dawns on me, he's like, what would I have done if I caught it? It would have been very interesting. And that bear was about a quarter of the size that David was, and if anybody's met my brother, he's 5 times the size David was. And he still wasn't taking on that bear. So,
you caught Yogi stealing the picnic basket.
Yep. So, unlike, again, lions, they have really thick skin, fat layers, they're extremely strong, they're good at close combat, if you know anything about a bear, and it can stand upright and strike with both paws. But David says, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb out of its mouth. He chased the bear, literally chased the bear. There is a very realistic picture of a young King David. He was bold. He was fierce. You could look at that and say, years later, a way of looking at it could say, that is my childhood trauma. Who here had to go through that? But you know what God was saying? I'm turning your trauma into training. The exact thing that I let you endure, the exact suffering that came through your life is going to become your training because I have something even bigger for you. And you're not going to be able to do it if I don't put you through the training that you need to do that. Because I have a giant that I'm planning on having you take down. And if you were not able to do this right here and endure through that, you're not going to be able to do what I'm planning on having you do because it's even going to look worse than that. So, with that in mind, remember, David was still a young kid when he was still out being a shepherd, and he goes to drop something off for Saul, and he hears this Philistine rattling a spear and making fun of the whole Israelite army. Here's something. You can look it up. Don't just take my word for it. Goliath had not killed anyone yet. Nobody. The Israelite army was in fear of a narrative. Of a narrative. They were in fear of something that could happen. It hadn't happened yet. Goliath had not stepped forward and killed anyone. He just stood there every day and shook his spear. And that's what the enemy is going to do in your life. He's going to stand there and say, hey, I have a narrative. If you attempt to do this, I'm going to destroy you. And David, King David, again, he says, your servant, now he's arguing in front of Saul. Let me go fight this guy. And Saul's like, you're just a kid. Stop. We have warriors out there that won't even take him on. But David's like, are you kidding me? Now, what does he use to convince Saul to let him go fight Goliath? I'm going to call it, he used his childhood trauma to say, hey, look what I did. When there was a lion or a bear, I took the lamb from the flock, I went after it, I struck him, I delivered it out of his mouth, and if he rose against me, if he turned on me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. This little kid. And he's using that story to convince Saul to let him fight Goliath. These very things that we could easily, we know the story. I'm trying to get you to see it from a different angle. The fact that these were pretty volatile moments in King David's life. And he's using it to convince Saul to let him take on Goliath. You come to me with a sword and a spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty. And you know one of the reasons why he was so bold? Read the story of David and Goliath, because he keeps saying, this uncircumcised Philistine, and he says that multiple times. And you think, why is David so fixated on that? But you realize circumcision was a sign of the covenant. And he said, this person is not part of the covenant, which makes this a spiritual battle. So, Saul's trying to put his armor on him. When he finally convinces him, like, you can go fight, he throws the armor off. This is a spiritual battle. And we can tell in our lives, if you've ever been married and you're just having one of those moments, and you're like, you know what? Hold on. This is spiritual. Something's happening right now spiritual. We need to pray against it. We need to recognize those moments, and that's what King David did here. First, he convinces Saul by taking his trauma as a child and saying, yeah, it might have been something that most children would not have to endure. However, I did it. I did it. The Lord got me through it, and that will now prepare me to do what he's sending me out to do. I will take on this giant. And he does it with that little leather sling. The thing that the shepherds carry, no matter where God has you. Maybe you think, I've been humbled. Wherever place you have, whatever, maybe you say, my talent or my spiritual gift doesn't seem to either be evident, or it's not as important as somebody else's. You could easily say, when he walked up with that sling, I bet there was some mighty soldiers in the Israelite army that had some pretty big spears, some pretty big helmets and shields, but they were fearful of the narrative of Goliath. And David was like, nope, spiritual battle, got my sling. And in God's hands, this little hunk of leather means a lot more than that spear. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And David yells that out as he runs into battle. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. He recognized the spiritual battle. That's what that word means right there when you read through it.
Pastor,
Yes.
how come he took 5 stones?
Took 5 stones because Goliath had 4 brothers. You got that?
Is there any record at all of David using the other?
No,
No.
no, not that I've ever found, even in historical context. But it's known biblically that because that question comes up a lot, and they're like, why did he take 5 stones? Because he's like, well, if, and I know we've talked about this in the past, I don't go too far into it, but Goliath was part of the Nephilim, which was there's a big story behind that, but they were basically giants. And then when Joshua, which if you've been here for a while, we spent almost a year in the book of Joshua, he goes into the promised land and removes some of the last of the Nephilim from that area. So, the Lord who delivered me from the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And then later on, God really prepares David. He prepares him because he says, I'm going to make you a shepherd so you learn how to protect your sheep. And then I'm going to make you a warrior by sending a lion and a bear into your young life. And then I'm going to make you a king. And you're going to be a shepherd of God's people. And David literally talks about it. He says, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. And that's the 23rd Psalm. David wrote it. So think about this moment. His whole life foreshadowed his role as a king. A king in Israel was often called the shepherd of his people. And he protected the weak. He faced danger, but he also trusted God. He trusted God, and you can see that. The training that God put him through, those moments that we can look back and say, that was a horrible, horrible time in my life. I don't even think about it. I don't talk about it. I don't do anything. I blot it out. Well, what if that was God's training for you for where he's sending you? Last week we learned how God spun Moses around and said, you're going back to Egypt. And he says, I had some pretty bad trauma there. I grew up there. And God says, yeah, that's part of your training. I had you grow up there so you knew their customs, you knew their language, you knew everything about them. So you're the best person to go back and interact with them to free my people. And now we see King David. And again, I just want you to see it from a different angle. Who here would send their kid out to be a shepherd in those days? I would have a tough time with that. It's pretty dangerous. We don't really think of it because we just heard this story over and over and over. So, he chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds to shepherd Jacob his people. This is in Psalms. He chose David his servant. So this is God speaking through the song, saying, I chose David. I made him a shepherd first so he could learn how to be a king. So the childhood trauma prepared David to become a protector of sheep, a defender of Israel, and a king chosen by God. The bear prepared him for Goliath. So what is God preparing you for? What's the stone that's going to go in your sling? If we got, was Cliff here? Where's Cliff? I have something for you today. And I've been praying about this, and this is, I thought about it, and I was like, Lord, I really want to do this, but it's Friday, and there's no possible way in snowstorms and everything else that I know I'm going to look this up, and it's going to be a week off for me to get these. And the exact ones that I wanted, with the verses that I wanted, were available to ship the next day to my house in Newport, Vermont in a snowstorm. And I'm like, okay, God, you've opened the door for this. So you're going to go around and everybody is going to take one stone. And this is going to be the stone that you're going to put in your sling this week. It'll work out. You'll see.
Can we get the sling too?
No, I'm not. The stone, no, is something. You put it in your pocket and you think about, you're good. That's a good question. I know if there's any young men sitting here, they all want the sling too. Yeah, like I want to try that. I will tell you though, if you don't know what you're doing, you will hit yourself. Speaking from a maybe experience. Yep. You know, the Word of God actually says that the enemy prowls around like a roaring lion. 1 Peter 5:8. He walks around like a roaring lion coming after you. So we need to recognize that spiritual battle. We need to see that. We need to know that whatever has happened in our past, God is going to use it to guide your future. He's going to use it to place you in ministry. He's going to use it. It's going to be your training. I was telling my wife, I said, if I ever got to write a book, I would love to write a book called Turn Your Trauma into Training with God. Because that's what he does. He takes those moments that we say that was horrible, and he says, I'm preparing you for something even bigger. Something that you can't even imagine, like that. So, this week, I want you to spend a little time reflecting on God's message to you on your stone. These stones have a certain set of verses that I really wanted and picked out. And on that stone is going to be a verse that's going to apply to you this week.
I just had a question. Has the speed of a stone and a sling ever been measured?
I know biblically it says that. I know one of the prophets talks about the shepherd's ability with a stone, and it says that they could take a hair off somebody's head. So, I mean, there's easier ways to get a haircut, but still, that's pretty impressive. I would imagine it has to be going pretty quick.
I mean, because they measure, the speed of a baseball.
Right. I bet it's way faster than that. You think about it, it went into the skull of Goliath and killed him. So, that stone had to be traveling pretty fast. Okay. What is God's message to you on your stone? Spend time reflecting it. Write down one area where you need to trust him more. And then meditate on 2 Corinthians 4:7 and remind yourself of your purpose that God has for you. And sometimes we just plain forget it. We say, well, this is my talent, but maybe I'm too old, or maybe I'm too young, or maybe I've failed a couple times, I'm not going to do this. But God says, you know what? I've prepared you. I'm going to use everything that you're looking back in your life as something you don't even want to remember, and it's going to be your training. Everybody got a stone?